the moment a soul becomes unreachable by God. The vision came to Padre Pio at dawn, not during prayer, not during Massachusetts. It arrived in the silence between sleep and waking, and the terror of it struck him before he understood what he was seeing clearly. The vision opened. Padre Pio saw a soul, one soul among millions. The soul was praying, the words were sincere, the faith was real, the gestures were correct, but something was different, something had changed. Heaven was reaching. God's grace moved toward the soul like light toward darkness, not as judgment, not as punishment, but as rescue, as invitation. The grace reached outward, seeking connection, seeking entry, but it could not reach, not because God had withdrawn, but because something in the soul had closed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. Over time, through choices the soul barely noticed. And now the distance was too great. Padre Pio watched, horrified. The soul continued praying. The words were correct. The posture was humble. The heart believed itself sincere. But heaven could not reach. The barrier was complete. The soul did not know. It felt nothing unusual. No warning, no sign. It believed its prayers still rose. It believed grace still flowed. It did not realize it had crossed a line from which there was no return. And that was the most terrifying part. Padre Pio felt his breathing stop. How does a soul become unreachable? How does the distance grow so vast that even God cannot bridge it? The vision paused. Padre Pio waited. Heaven did not explain. It only showed. He saw the same soul years earlier, younger, open. Grace flowed freely then. The connection was strong, clear. God reached, and the soul responded. There was no barrier, no distance. But then something shifted. The soul made a choice, small, barely noticeable. It turned away from something God asked, not in rebellion, not in anger, just in preference, a quiet no. And grace pulled back, not in rejection, but in respect. God does not force, God invites. And when the soul said no, grace withdrew. The soul felt nothing. The choice had been small, insignificant, hardly worth remembering. But something had changed. The next time grace came, the soul said no again, still small, still quiet, still barely noticed. And grace withdrew again. The pattern repeated. Each no created distance. Each refusal built the barrier, not all at once, but incrementally, layer by layer, choice by choice. The soul did not realize what was happening. The changes were too gradual, the distance too subtle. Life continued normally. Prayers were still spoken, rituals still observed, but beneath the surface, something was dying. The connection was fraying. Grace came less frequently, not because God had changed, but because the soul had created resistance. What had once been an open door was now barely cracked. What had once been immediate response was now delayed hesitation. And with each delay, the gap widened. The soul adapted to the absence. It learned to function without the fullness of grace. It found other things to fill the space. Not evil things necessarily, just lesser things, distractions, comforts. Until one day, grace reached and could not touch. The soul still prayed, still attended Massachusetts, still appeared faithful to everyone watching, but the interior had closed. The barrier was complete, and heaven could not penetrate. Padre Pio saw another soul, different from the first. This one had committed no great sin, no scandal, no betrayal. It attended Mass faithfully, it prayed daily, it appeared faithful, but it had closed. The closing had begun with small things, ignored promptings, dismissed convictions, quiet compromises that no one else saw, little accommodations between what the soul knew and what the soul wanted. At first, the soul felt guilt. The conscience was still alive, grace still touched, but over time, the guilt faded, not because the actions stopped, but because the conscience had been silenced. The soul had grown comfortable with the compromise. What had once caused discomfort now felt normal, and grace, once welcomed, was now an intrusion. The soul began to avoid the moments when grace came strongest. It skipped certain prayers. It avoided certain people. It stayed away from places where conviction might stir. Not consciously, not deliberately, but instinctively. The soul was protecting itself from grace. And with each avoidance, the barrier thickened. What had been transparent became opaque. What had been soft became hard. The soul was sealing itself from the inside. Padre Pio watched the moment when grace could no longer reach. There was no lightning bolt, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, final pulling away. The soul had sealed itself shut, and God, who would not force entry, could not enter. Nothing moved for a long moment. Padre Pio felt the weight of what he was witnessing. This was not abandonment. This was self-imprisonment. The vision deepened. Padre Pio began to see the pattern heaven was revealing. The souls that became unreachable had not all committed terrible sins. Many appeared faithful, some attended church more than those who remained reachable, but they all shared something. They had learned to say no, not loudly, not defiantly, but consistently, and each no pushed grace further away. At first, grace returned quickly. The soul could reverse course with a single yes. The barrier was thin, the distance small. One genuine turning could restore everything, but the soul did not turn back, and over time, the barrier thickened. The distance grew. The soul's capacity to respond diminished, not because God withdrew further, but because the soul had changed. It had adapted to the absence. It had learned to live without the connection. Until finally, grace could no longer penetrate. The soul had become unreachable, not because God had given up, but because the soul had become impervious. The repeated refusals had hardened something inside. What had once been soft and responsive had become rigid and closed. Grace still reached, but it could not enter. The vision paused again. Padre Pio felt heaven preparing to show him something deeper. Not just what had happened, but why it worked this way. Why grace could not simply break through. Why God allowed souls to become unreachable. The silence stretched. His hands trembled. The room felt heavier. Then the vision resumed, but differently now. Padre Pio saw that heaven does not make souls unreachable. Heaven does not seal the barrier. Heaven does not create the distance. The soul does. Each choice to refuse grace strengthens the barrier, not because God punishes refusal, but because refusal changes the soul. It hardens. It closes. It becomes less capable of responding. The soul is not designed to resist grace indefinitely. Grace is what keeps the soul alive. Refusing grace is like refusing air. At first, the body compensates, but over time, it suffocates. The soul works the same way. At first, the soul can still choose. The barrier is thin. Grace can still break through with a whisper. But if the soul continues to refuse, the whisper becomes harder to hear. Not because God speaks more quietly, but because the soul has grown deaf. The capacity to hear has been damaged. Eventually, grace must shout to be heard at all. And if the soul refuses even the shout, silence follows. Not because God has stopped reaching, but because the soul can no longer hear. The capacity has been destroyed. The repeated refusals have damaged something essential. And once that damage is complete, even God cannot repair it without violating the soul's freedom. Padre Pio understood now. The unreachable soul was not abandoned. It was self-enclosed. It had chosen, over and over, to say no. And those choices had built a prison God could not break, not because God lacked power, but because breaking it would violate the soul's freedom. And God will not force, even to save. The vision shifted once more. Padre Pio now saw something that disturbed him deeply. He saw souls who believed they could refuse grace indefinitely. They told themselves they would return later, tomorrow, next year, when life was less busy, when things were easier. They did not realize the barrier was building. They did not understand that each refusal made the next return harder. That postponement was not neutral. That delay had a cost. That later was becoming never without them noticing. One such soul appeared in the vision. A man. He felt the pull of grace regularly. Convictions came. Moments of clarity arrived. He knew what he should do, but he postponed. Not forever, just for now. He told himself he would respond later, when he was ready, when the timing was better, when the cost felt less steep. But later never came, because with each postponement, the barrier grew. With each delay, grace became easier to ignore. The convictions came less frequently. The clarity dimmed. What had once felt urgent now felt distant. Until finally, grace came and he felt nothing. The man continued his life. He did not feel lost. He did not feel abandoned. He believed he could return whenever he chose. But he could not. The barrier was complete, and he did not realize it. He went to Massachusetts. He said prayers. He appeared the same to everyone around him. But inside, he was sealed. Grace reached and could not enter. The postponement had become permanent. Padre Pio watched as grace reached for this man one final time. The grace was strong, powerful, insistent. Heaven made one last attempt, but it could not penetrate. The man felt nothing. He went about his day, unaware that the moment of decision had passed, unaware that he had become unreachable, unaware that the postponement had cost him everything. The vision began to fade. Padre Pio remained still. He would never teach this to terrify souls. he would never use it as a weapon. That would poison the very thing he wanted to protect. But he would warn quietly. Those who came to him complaining that grace felt distant, that prayer felt empty, that God seemed far away, he would tell them gently, grace does not reach forever without response. Not because God grows tired, but because the soul grows closed. And there comes a moment when the closing is complete. Do not postpone. Do not delay. Do not tell yourself tomorrow. Because each refusal builds the barrier. Each delay thickens the wall. And the barrier, once complete, cannot be undone. Not because God refuses to break it, but because breaking it would destroy the very freedom that makes salvation meaningful. He sat in silence long after the vision ended. The room felt colder now, not oppressive, but sobering. The truth remained with him, not as comfort, but as warning. God reaches for every soul, but not every soul remains reachable. Some close so gradually they never notice, until the day grace can no longer enter, and by then, it is too late.